The use case we're going to do is a carryover from last month. So if you do recall, last month we worked with Bobby Garzikowski at Outfront, and we looked at a fashion brand. This was a kind of a made-up brand, but mimicking kind of what might happen in real life. And for this use case, we want to focus in a different part of that. So Enza's here to give us an agency perspective on that. And a lot of times when we've done these use cases, we've looked at that area of, okay, I've RFP'd this out and I've gotten all these units back, and how do I sift through that and how do I make my decisions? We wanted to go back even a little further with this use case, and how do we get from that client briefing to an RFP that's going to allow Enza and her team to really look at the units and be more efficient and make sure that the communication flow is kind of really when it needs to be for, to make sure everybody is on the same page with what's coming back and what's going out. So that's where a lot of the conversation will be around today as well. And so just to refresh, the brand is Maza. They're a new luxury fashion brand, high-end fashion, trying to establish themselves in New York City, again, one of the top fashion markets across the globe. So they want to introduce themselves here to the US market. And they compete with fashion brands like Gucci and Prada, other competitive Italian brands, so to speak. And they're trying to reach that young, trendy urbanite. So I'm going to pause here, and I just want to ask Enza, this was our example of a client brief. And, is this sometimes the extent to what you get from a client, or maybe even a new client like this,
Yeah, I mean, in most cases, if we get this is actually a lot. So it's a lot of information.
Really?
Yeah, sometimes we don't even get things like, competes with specific brands. We might get things where it's, we're reaching young, trendy urbanites, but understanding competitive sets were really important. So if we don't get that level of information, we'll ask for it, because it's a really great way to understand, just level set what it is that we're up against and try to understand an audience perspective. In some cases, we actually get even more information where they might give us segmentation studies that they've done, where they may have really specific characteristics that they're giving us. And they may say, somebody that spends X amount of money per month, or or are willing to spend on high fashion brands. So it really does vary by client. The more information we have, the better decisions that we can make in terms of defining the audience. So it's really critical that we at least start with something like this and then go on to try to discover more.
Okay, so this is not this feels kind of
real. Yeah, it was good.
When
you guys did this last month, I was like, this is great. I mean, like I said, I wish we would get at least this as a basis from everybody.
Okay, and so then what's next for you? I know you started to talk about that a little bit, but this was an example of some secondary research we had done in the last use case. Is this realistic?
It's very realistic. Again, I think if the buyers out there and the planners out there have the time to do this, this is a great way to try to understand an audience and really get to characteristics versus just trying to look at a demographic. When we say young, hip, trendy urbanites, what are we thinking of? Okay, so it's going to be adults, maybe 21 to 34, because we want a higher household income, but there's so much more beyond those demographics. So sometimes doing a little bit of homework like this can really give you the psychographic pieces that will enhance who that audience might be. And really looking at it from the standpoint of what's the behavior that we're looking for, what's their life stage, what's the psychographics behind their purchase patterns that can make the most sense. So yes, doing homework like this would be phenomenal if we have the time. Like I said, in some instances, some clients actually give us this. Yeah, they provide it, and then you're golden. The trick is really trying to then translate it over to what's available to us in in the insight suites, right? So if we have all of this, what do we have available that makes the most sense?
Okay, so that's what you're doing. So you're getting this, you got that high level client brief, maybe been able to do some secondary research, you kind of know who their target is, and so then you come into the insight suite, so to speak, or whatever that you're accessing through the API. And the last use case, we kind of landed on this young digerati. So what happens next? Let's say you find this audience out and seems great. do you just run with that, or what happens?
Well, no, if the ideal scenario again would be, finding this Prism Premier structure already done was really, again, great idea, wonderful. It works out really well because when you look at the definition of young digerati, it fits with what we were looking at, on those earlier pages. But I would always run this by the client, and I would run it by the planning teams with the general agencies to make sure that this fits with what they're thinking their audience is and what they're planning the other media against. So I would run this by them. The other thing I might want to do is, that there are other single characteristics within Insight Suite that's not a Prism Premier that might make sense, right? So there's some statements in there about, I care about, high quality fashion versus price. That might offer up something that's interesting. So a lot of times what I'll do is I will work with the general planning team or the research team at the client to say, these are the potential audiences that make the most sense to me based on what you've given me. I think that the Prism Premier segment 4 makes the most sense, but here are some other alternatives. Do we want to look at those? Do we prefer to only look at this one? So in some cases, we might actually look at multiple audiences at the same time, or we might just go and choose this one. They said this one fit perfectly from the description, so it made sense.
So is this an early step? Like, are there multiple things happening at the same time, or is it like we need to get our audience set first before we can even go forward?
Great question. I would love to be able to tell you that it's a very linear, and it's not. There's definitely other things going on. A lot of times while while our team is looking to pull in the target audience and looking at what's available, we're probably running things already behind the ones that we think make the most sense. But ultimately, before we send the RFP out, ideally we'll have the client buy in on the audience. Yes. Yes. That otherwise we're just going to be spinning wheels.
Gotcha. And so that leads to kind of this actually good segue into the next part of this use case where we're in that strategic planning phase. And, this is, if you joined last month, this kind of the guts, so to speak, of those beginning stages of a brief or a RFP development. And, just again, to revisit clients' high-end fashion brand, the Maza. But one of the key things that I've underlined here is this idea of like, I want high impact placements. I want to create big awareness. Like, again, one that seems pretty it doesn't seem unusual.
It's a very common.
But it's very vague. Like, what do you do with that?
I'm sure all the media operators out there are cringing because I can't tell you how many RFPs you've probably gotten just in the past couple of days, asking for things like that. And I think that the trick of this is, high impact actually does have some meaning. It's not as vague as you think it is when it comes to the fashion industry, right? So knowing what the competitors are doing and knowing what fashion brands look for, high impact generally means they like to look at big units. They like to look at them in specific areas of the market where they think this type of audience might be located. I think it's important for us to build out and give better direction to our partners out there. So that's why having the formats where we say things that aren't digital bulletins and that we want walls and murals can make a lot of sense because it'll help focus it. Because otherwise, what's high impact for me may not necessarily be the same thing for one of the operators. But you have to put it in the perspective of the client. So when you're looking at a fashion brand, I know that some of you guys out there that might have some phenomenal digital screens may think that they're high impact. They're great. But for this fashion brand, we have to think about what that really means for them. So I think it's on us to give that direction of the type of formats that actually might actually represent.
Okay. Cool.
And I think that the other thing that's really important on here is that when we define an audience, so if I'm pulling something from the Insight Suite, whether it's the Prism segment or whether it is the high fashion, high quality, don't care about price scenario, it's really important for us to let our partners, our media partners know what that audience is, because how else are they then going to evaluate anything? And I sometimes wonder how much of that is actually happening out there. We sometimes forget to give them like, look, we're going to be running numbers against this audience. Right. So when you're evaluating your packages that you're sending over, do it against this audience.
Right. And that's a good point. And, one of the things when we were developing the best practices document that hopefully many of you have downloaded and been able to look at, but that was one of the key things that I'm thinking about. Like, we have 8,000 audiences and we're great and we celebrate that, but it also creates the need to be
Very specific.
very specific about what you want so that you get what you want back. Right. So cool. Great point. And so then as we were developing this together, we talked about, this point about, New York, but even still, you want to explore, you're going to explore the market first before moving on. And
right.
kind of what does that mean for you when you're doing this?
I mean, there's a lot of different things that we're going to play around with, and it kind of goes back to an earlier question that you asked in terms of what's happening simultaneously. It's we're getting, approval on our audiences. What we're doing is we're going in and understanding the makeup of the market. Now, New York, I'm based in New York, so I know it pretty well. But my first step is still to go back into the system to understand who are the operators, what do they have in the marketplace, what am I looking at, what kind of areas might make the most sense for this audience, and understanding that becomes, I think, the most critical piece, so that again I can give better direction to our partners, so when they come back to us, we're not just all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so looking at this one is the example, looking at target impressions. And so,
yeah, I think, one of the things that we really wanted to look at it, last month when the webinar was given, it was given from the perspective of a media operator. So now we just want to do a level set here and show you guys. So this is what, Bobby took a look at to say, okay, if we were looking at the top 25 out front units that were doing really well based on target audience impressions against this audience, where would they be located? Mm-hmm. So I would look at it a little bit differently, because obviously I'm going to be looking at it more from the perspective of what operators give me a good swath of impressions against this audience. So,
and you might be getting this, you would get multiple versions of this.
Yeah,
right?
I could get this from Bobby, from Out Front, and I
from,
could get it from Clear Channel, or from Interstate, and any, the smaller operators that are in there. I could get this from everybody, whoever I'm going to be RFPing. So this is valid from the from the operator standpoint, but from my standpoint, I need to look at it a little bit broader. So what I would do is I would go in, if I'm looking at it based on target impressions, and this is a whole separate conversations on how you should look at it. But if we're looking at it based on target impressions, I'm not just going to look at the top 25, because a lot of times that really limits what you're going to get back. So I'll look at the filter. Actually, the largest filter that's available to us is, I believe, the top 100. So when I look at it across multiple operators, where are the top 100 units based on target audience impressions for this young Digerati? And you can see it's a little different. It's very different than what was coming up when I was just looking at a single operator. So I'm starting to see units on the New Jersey Turnpike, that wasn't in there before. You're seeing things in downtown Manhattan. You're seeing things in Brooklyn. You're seeing things in Long Island City, and even out in Queens, a little bit closer to, I think that's like right by the airport, or on one of those, So, you're starting to see units that are popping up that are very different than what was on that, the prior one, because now we're opening it up. Now, again, this is based on target impressions. So the New Jersey Turnpike has a ton of traffic on there. So of course, units like that are going to pop up.
Right.
Okay. When you look at it from a reach perspective, it's a similar story. Again, when we looked at it last month, when you guys did it, you're still kind of concentrated in the main areas of Manhattan. You're looking at, again, it's going to be Times Square. It'll be Midtown by Penn Station, by Port Authority. You do have some units that are popping up in Brooklyn and Long Island City, but again, it's still pretty concentrated. When I look at it, and I'm looking at it across multiple operators, for this one I actually did top 50, because it got a little crazy actually with the top 100. But when I'm looking at top 50, it's giving me similar patterns to what I was looking at with the impressions, where
and that makes you feel, that kind of
feel
affirms,
good.
right?
Well, it affirms a couple of things, right? It's going to affirm, again, my knowledge of the market is, if I want a high fashion brand to have impact in the New York market, most people will focus on Manhattan only. Right, Manhattan, and downtown Manhattan. That's pretty much the way that we look at things. But this gives me a little bit of license to go back to the client and say, I don't know if you're ever going to look and consider New Jersey Turnpike for a high fashion brand, but if we are truly talking about reach and doing a high reach campaign, we might want to consider pulling in a unit. somewhere along there. It might have to be a really
Well,
special unit.
When you think about, again, knowing the market, you think about Short Hills, the Short Hills Mall,
exactly.
and things like that.
Right. So that this becomes, I think, some of the ways that we can talk to our clients to let them know that there's things beyond just the gut feeling and the instinct, and even the perceptions that we have of the market, to go out and look at units that might be a little outside what their comfort zone is.
Right. And I think one thing I want to make a point of too, and I know we did mention this last month, and just in the way we're talking about it now, it's the kind of art and science to it, right? It's that, yes, we are able to provide so much more data than ever before with Geopath Insights, but it's still that local market knowledge. You do have, whether it's New York, whether it's Poughkeepsie or wherever, you bring that level of knowledge, and one shouldn't trump the other, so to speak, right?
No, it's always a combination of the two. The numbers really should help support some of, the way I've always looked at it, and the way that I've tried to teach people in my career is that, you use your knowledge, use your skills to think about what would make the most sense for this client, and then see if the numbers pan out. If they don't, then it's kind of it's a different aha moment, right? It's an aha of oh wow, I have to think about this a little bit differently. Or it could be, wow, I was really good, I was really close, and here's what makes the most sense for the project.
Okay.
Now, this one is actually my favorite. I think, if anyone has ever heard me do these webinars before, I really expound on composition quite a bit. It really gives you a very different look at the market, because we're not just talking about large units that have a ton of impressions being built behind it, or a lot of reach because it's in these high traffic areas. When you're talking about composition, you're really talking about audience concentration, right? That's what that word really means, audience concentration. So when you look at it, you get a slightly different skew of the type of units that might make the most sense. So when you guys looked at it last month, within Outfront, you could see again, there's Outfront's inventory tends to fall within these areas, so they popped up. But again, now all of a sudden, look, units down in Brooklyn popped up, which was phenomenal. Like, those weren't on those earlier ones when we were looking at reach and when we were looking at impressions. And you even have another one out in Jersey, where again, it didn't pop up earlier. But when I look at it again across multiple operators, you really see an even greater story. It's again still concentrated in those areas, but then look again in Brooklyn, look again in Long Island City and other areas of the boroughs, where all of a sudden you're really seeing a lot of units that fall in clusters of where these people are, and operators like UAC or Lure or Alchemy, Colossal pop up because they have a good concentration of that audience with their units. They may not get a ton of impressions as compared to some of the other units, but it's showing you the concentration. Now, for some of the folks out there who don't have access to heat maps or other information on the audience and where they might be, this also gives me a sense of the areas I may want to focus in on. So what I might want to be able to do is, this for me as a starting point would be, it's not necessarily that I want just these units, but I might evaluate it and say, you know what, when I send out my RFP, I'm going to ask for units that are concentrated in 3 to 4 areas off of here. It's going to be downtown Manhattan, which again, I knew, but now I've got the proof. So that my aha moment here is like, yay, good job. But I'm also going to make sure that I do Brooklyn, and not only one area of Brooklyn, there's several places in Brooklyn that might make sense. And then as well as Long Island City. So it gives me some input and gives me some direction to be able to give that back to the media operators to say, here's where I want to focus some of the units. Now I might ask for a combination, right? I might ask for a combination of, I don't want just high composition units. I want units that have a nice impression.
So this helps you get to that point, and then you could start to decide, okay, do I want some reach, or I want some impressions?
Exactly. So from a starting standpoint, it's not just about the units that are actually popping up, but where are these units popping up? So it's really interesting in some ways to sometimes, when you take a look at it, is to almost go beyond the scope of the ask, which was non-digital bulletins and walls, right? And look at what else is in this area that can make a lot of sense. And when you look at a map like that, and you can see there's street furniture all over the place, which, again, if we're based in New York, we know that that's the case. Now, what's interesting about this is that this just gives me a better sense of all of the opportunities I might have and all of the things that I might want to consider that fall within the area that I think is going to be, you know, really conducive for this client. Now, are we going to buy street furniture? I don't know. Most fashion brands like their big, iconic, high impact placements. But I actually look at this and I see a slightly different story. So for those of you who have street furniture, you might look at this and say, well, you know what if I create a mini saturation for this brand? If I create a mini saturation in a high concentrated area, then that allows me to tell this brand that your high impact means that there are people going to be walking down there and they're going to see you everywhere,
every block,
big, small, little, right? That gives you a very different kind of impact than just being on a big unit. So it gives me license and it gives me rationale to go back to the client and say, I have a different idea for you. They may not buy into it, but I've got some ideas.
So that brings up, I'm sure maybe some operators on that call are like, okay, great, but you're not asking for that. How do I give you that? Like how does an operator let you know that?
Well, I think, there's two different ways to answer that. One, this is something that I would do normally myself, is go through this and try to see if there's something that I can come up with that might make a lot of sense. So I might actually ask you for it. On the flip side, if I haven't asked you for it and you have those types of units that you think might make, you know, a lot of sense, and you want to propose something outside of the parameters of the RFP, that's okay. I'm always willing to look at that. And that's something that we try to teach our team all the time, is like, be open to the conversations, share as much as you possibly can, because you never know what you might get back. The only thing that I would ask is that you do it separately. So a lot of times, you know, unfortunately, we are a grid-based world. Everything goes out on grids because everything has to be ingested into, you know, systems and software. So do it on a separate tab. Do it on a, you know, Scott had said, well, you know, do it on a separate tab, or maybe even a completely separate file can make the most sense, because I know the grids that we sent out sometimes have multiple tabs. Send it out as a separate file. Don't not do it, but don't muck up the original request.
Don't hinder the original request by trying to you know, be clear.
Be clear and say, okay. And in some cases you may say, you know what, I don't really have anything that fits your high impact, but this is what I have. I'm all for that. I mean, I think some of you who may have gotten RFPs from me recently, you know that I'm always kind of like, and if you think of anything that can make sense, don't hesitate to throw it in there. Just be cognizant of how you're doing it, because again, the reason why those grids, I know people hate them, but they just make our lives so much easier when we're trying to evaluate across multiple operators. You know, we're not just looking at the 25 units coming out from out front, we're looking across, you know, everybody.
Okay, cool. Great. And so the next thing we did here with this use case is we wanted to look back at the kind of results of the last month, where we landed, right? And so this is just a kind of side by side, you know, the map of the three different looks at the sets of units. And we looked at, again, across impressions, reach, composition. And so question is, like, you know, Enza, what would you do? Like, would you want the operator to share them with you in this way? Would you have like a set of impression based or reach based, or kind of what kind of information do you want back, and how do you want it?
Yeah, I mean, personally, no, I don't want three separate packages or submissions based, you know, by operator based on impressions, reach, or composition. I think it's up to me and up to the buyers to really lay out some parameters for the operators. So for me, the way that I would look at it is I would try to give someone a baseline composition number that I would want to look at, right? So if I'm looking at that composition, you know, this is the way that you guys looked at this is phenomenal when you think about it, right? Look at, you know, and even overlaying it this way, I might do this myself. This type of analysis, once I get all of the proposals in, I might look at it this way, which makes a lot of sense to kind of take a look at, oh, wow, okay, so here are my, you know, target composition units, there are my reach units, where is their overlap, where is they're not overlap, because I'm going to want to pick and choose from all three of these categories. I think that that's really the most important thing. There's very few instances where a client will only want high reach and nothing else. Because if you're only looking at high reach, that means you have a lot of waste, and you're paying for that. right? Because you're paying for those units.
Right.
So you really have to do a balancing act between the metrics to understand which units will make the most sense and ultimately get to whatever goal you've established. Looking at it on a map like this is actually really interesting. I like doing it. You know, I'm like rethinking it now. I might say to an operator and say, yes, you know, break it out for me this way, but more importantly, I would want their best units sent to me, and then I would do this type of analysis.
But you would
myself.
tell, like, quote unquote best units, you're giving them that
Yeah,
metric.
yes,
that they're gonna base that on,
I would
and
say
be clear
something,
about.
you know, again, I might want to tell them, you know, just focus on reach, maybe, if that's what I want. Or I might say focus on reach with a base composition of X.
Okay.
To give them some direction as to what to pull.
Okay, cool.
And
I just want to pause. Oh, sorry.
No, I just, and again, for those of you who have heard me speak before, I think that the main thing is always, all of these answers are, it depends. It will depend on the project. It will depend on the campaign. It will depend on what the actual objectives of the campaign are.
Okay. So, I know we've been talking for quite a bit now, and I just wanted to pause and just check in with Brian, see if there's any questions or anything we want to.
No, nothing yet.
Okay, great. And again, if there's questions, feel free to reach out and add them to the chat or the Q&A module. Sorry. And so then, kind of, what happens next? Like, what is the kind of key takeaway? So we've gone through this kind of early part. We got briefed by the client. We found our audience. We looked at the inventory. We're trying to figure out, kind of get down to that point where you're starting to sift through all the information you get back. So getting to that, kind of creating the clear RFP that's going to allow you to do that.
Right.
So we wanted to just kind of start talking about some of that.
To me, you know, I think we touched upon this earlier. It's really incumbent upon, you know, us as planners and buyers of the medium to make sure that we clearly define the target audience for our partners. You know, the worst thing to do is to say high impact units for a fashion audience and then not give them something, and then you're evaluating it on something completely different than adults 18 plus. So we really, all of us have to get on the same page to ensure that when we define an audience, especially when we're looking at a very specific segment like that from Prism, or we're looking at one line item that has some sort of a psychographic statement, that we're really clear with the operators that that's what we're going to be using as part of the evaluation.
Cool.
You know, I think it is important to be specific about the media types we want to consider. You know, the worst thing that it's ever, you know, comes through is when you, especially you're looking at a market like New York, where you have quite a few operators out there and everybody wants to put their stuff forward, and all of a sudden I'm getting, you know, 50, 60, 70 different proposals back, and each one can have anywhere from 5 to 20 units. That's a lot. So if there are specific formats that we think are really important, it's again important for us to let them know. Again, do not let this sway you from not providing some units that you think might make sense that are outside of the parameters. Just do it separately. Don't do it on that same.
And would that be something, so as I look at this statement, like one thing I could read into it is like, you know, just the previous conversation, like, yes, we're focusing on walls and bulletins, but I am open to X, Y, and Z. Like, is that something that you would communicate out?
Yeah, I try to. I don't always do it because it will depend on, there's my favorite words, it will depend on that project, but this is going to be very personal to every planner buyer. If I'm asking you very specifically for bulletins and walls, and I'm not making a statement like, if you think that there's something else you might want to consider, I would ask, if I was the operator, I would ask, hey, would you consider something like this? And I may say, you know what, I can't for this one. If I don't put it, that's if I don't put it in there. Because yeah, I'd like to say that I do it all the time, but I don't. But I think it's just respectful to ask if someone else, if someone else would consider adding in different elements.
Okay.
You know, for us, I think it's really important, you know, while I don't want to always make it about geography, right? The whole idea behind an audience-based system is that it kind of frees us just from a physicality of a location. But understanding areas of concentration is really important. it helps to focus and provide some specific direction for our partners so that they can give us the relevant units that make the most sense. Because if I just say the New York DMA, I'm going to get stuff from all over the place, and that just doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So giving them, areas of concentration is I think, ideal. The metrics, we touched upon this earlier, are really important to balance. It's never a one and done type of thing. Composition gives us a base level of understanding that audience concentration. But what do we mean by high reach? What do we mean by high impressions? Which are the things that we're going to focus on the most? So being able to give people that kind of direction, letting them know, I don't want to consider anything that's above this percentage, or it has to be at least average composition. I would prefer things at 120 comp index. That's typically something I might say. And then I want units that have, your highest reach units against that audience. That's going to give me a nice balance of concentration, as well as maximizing the client's budget to get, a reach number. Now, again, everything is going to be relative to the project that you're working on, but it's important that we let
right, because quoting, that's like in quotes, like high, it's dependent on, high might be
exactly. And then ultimately you have a CPM, right? You're ultimately going to analyze whether those units make the most sense from an efficiency standpoint.
Brian, just checking in again as we're nearing the end of the session. Just want to check in to see if there are any other questions that might have come in or anything.
Yeah, there's one about how you determine the composition area.
So just in case, so just to repeat it, I know Brian's kind of far away from the mic, but how do you determine the composition area?
So if I don't know if we can have a chance to go back to the map. So the way to think about it is, so you have evaluating composition and evaluating the area for composition are two different things, right? So if we want to look at areas of that show a high concentration of the audience, when I'm looking at a map like this, again, it's not heat coded based on the audience, but where are the clusters of my units? So if I'm looking at where these units are clustered, you can see, again, that downtown Soho, Chelsea area that, again, makes very great sense for an audience like this. And then you look at, where you have clusters of units. So you have that cluster down there. You have a cluster off to the right there's like 3 walls in purple there. That allows me to say that might be an area that will make sense for me to look at what other units are there that might give me more reach, but may not have a high composition. So hopefully that makes sense. So it's more like eyeballing the map to understand where these units that have a very high concentration of the audience, where are they physically located, that then determines that might be an area that I want to go and focus on.